Now, imagine a Hollywood legend, Clint Eastwood, learning that the man who risked his life for his career, his former stuntman, is now struggling in silence. What does Clint do next? The answer will shock you. He doesn't just offer help. He goes above and beyond in a way that will have you questioning the true meaning of loyalty and redemption. A gesture so powerful, it will make you rethink everything you know about friendship, sacrifice, and second chances. Stay with us till the end, because you won't believe what happens next. Before we dive into today's incredible story, I want to know, where are you watching this video from? Drop a comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartwarming tales. Clint Eastwood, once a household name synonymous with the rugged, stoic cowboy and gritty action hero, now lives far removed from the glimmer of Hollywood lights. The days of gunfights, horseback rides, and the adrenaline-fueled excitement of his prime are nothing more than faded memories. He resides in a small town nestled away from the frantic rush of fame. His days are slower now, peaceful, private, and comforting in their simplicity. Every morning, Clint wakes before dawn, as he always did, though now it's for different reasons. He strolls the quiet streets, breathing in the crisp air that carries a sense of stillness. The mornings are his time to reflect. He's alone, save for the occasional passing of a neighbor, someone who respects his need for solitude, but also knows that Clint Eastwood, the icon, is something of the past. At home, Clint sits in his study, a room that holds remnants of a bygone era. The walls are adorned with awards and accolades that once defined his career. A bookshelf lined with old scripts, a film projector tucked away in the corner. These relics no longer carry the same weight they once did. Sometimes, when the silence gets too thick, Clint pops in an old VHS of one of his movies. The familiar strains of a theme song from his westerns flood the room, and for a brief moment, he is transported back to those days. The screen flickers with the image of his younger self, more vibrant, more alive. Yet, there is always a lingering ache in Clint, a quiet unease that settles in his chest as the images on the screen flicker away. Something from his past feels unresolved, an echo that refuses to fade. It's a quiet gnawing that can't be ignored. The movies, the fame, the glory, they filled the void of family, of connection, when Clint needed it most. But now, as he looks around at the space he's carved out for himself, it feels empty in a way that fame never could. There's a sense of loneliness in the quiet, a deep and pervasive solitude. As Clint sits in his study one evening, a knock at the door pulls him from his thoughts. It's a letter, unassuming in its simplicity, with no return address. At first, Clint dismisses it as just another piece of forgotten fan mail, another relic of his past life that still manages to find its way to him. But something about it feels different. He picks it up, turning it over in his hands. And then he sees the name on the return address, Rick. Rick. The name stirs something deep inside Clint. A name he hadn't thought about in years. A name that once meant the world to him in a way few others did. Rick was not just a colleague, not just another face in the crew. Rick had been Clint's stuntman, his partner in the dangerous, heart-racing world of Hollywood action. They'd spent years together on set, sharing close calls, laughs, and an unspoken bond of trust. Rick had thrown himself into every scene, no hesitation, no fear. He had given his all to Clint's films, his body battered and bruised by the demands of a career built on risk. Yet Clint had promised him more than just respect on set. He had promised loyalty, promised that no matter where their paths took them, they would always look out for each other. But in the years since their last film together, Clint had lost touch. He had moved on, leaving Hollywood behind for a quieter life, and with that, Rick had faded from his mind. The fame, the family of filmmakers, the next big movie, it had all consumed him. Now, as Clint reads the letter, the flood of guilt hits him with the weight of a freight train. The words are simple, but they land like a punch to the gut. Rick is struggling. The life he had built is falling apart. His body, once strong and resilient from years of stunts, is now failing him. Decades of physical sacrifice have taken their toll. His career, which once defined him, is nothing but a memory now. He's left with nothing but the painful reminder of a life spent in service to a dream that no longer exists. And the worst part, he's alone. He's isolated in his declining years, left to face his demons without the camaraderie they once shared. Rick isn't asking for money. He's not asking for fame or a return to his glory days. His words are simple, heartfelt. He just wants to reconnect. To remind Clint of the promise they made to each other so many years ago. To ask Clint if he's still willing to stand by him, as he once promised. It's a request not for charity, but for friendship, for acknowledgement, for the bond that, for Clint, has been buried beneath years of fame, success, and the clutter of a busy life. Clint stares at the letter in his hands, unable to move. The ache in his chest deepens. How had he let this happen? How could he have ignored a man who had risked so much for him? A man who had been there, day in and day out, putting his life on the line to help Clint build the career that now defined him. Clint's mind races through the memories, flashbacks to the days on set when Rick had thrown himself into one dangerous stunt after another. How Rick had grinned through the pain, always ready for the next challenge. "I promised you, Rick," Clint whispers to the empty room, the weight of the words settling heavily on him. He had promised more than just a career together. He had promised to be there, to never let Rick face the world alone. But Clint had failed. As the years went by, he let the distractions of his own life pull him away. Now Clint is faced with the consequences of that neglect. A man who once stood by him through every perilous stunt, every battle, every hardship, is struggling. And Clint, the man who once led the charge, now finds himself unsure of what to do. Should he reach out? Is it too late to rebuild what was lost? Should he have done more sooner? These questions haunt him as the words on the page blur before his eyes. The letter sits on Clint's desk, heavy in its silence. But as he sits there, his mind drifts, and the world around him fades into a memory of brighter days. Days filled with adrenaline, the sound of galloping hooves, and the cheers of an audience that knew him as the man who never backed down. His memories of Rick are vivid. Clint can almost hear the crack of a whip in the air, the dust rising from the desert floor as a horse charges through the scene. He can see Rick, always in the background, always in motion. While Clint was the face of every film, it was Rick who was the unsung hero, the one who risked it all. Clint's mind takes him back to those first years in the wild world of westerns and action films, when Clint and Rick were not just colleagues, but companions in the thrill of the unknown. Rick had been with Clint from the very start, part of the crew that made Clint's rise to fame possible. At first, it had been just a job, a way for Rick to make a living in the dangerous world of stunts. But for Clint, it became something deeper. Rick wasn't just another stuntman, he was the one Clint trusted, the one Clint admired. When the cameras were rolling and the action was at its peak, it was Rick who made it look real. Clint never had to worry when Rick was on set. He could trust him with anything. One memory rises above the others, a moment that seems to encapsulate the bond between them. It was during the filming of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, the legendary shootout that became one of Clint's most iconic scenes. The script called for a dangerous stunt, a dive from a cliff into a narrow ravine, a scene that required precision and a little bit of madness. Clint had insisted that it be real. There was no room for fakes in Clint's world. Rick, of course, was the first to volunteer. "I've got it," he'd said, a mischievous smile on his face. There was never a doubt in Clint's mind that Rick wouldn't give his all. As they stood on the cliff edge, Clint couldn't help but feel the tension in the air. The wind howled, the sun setting behind them in a perfect silhouette. Rick stood there, unfazed, adjusting his gear like it was just another day at work. "Ready when you are, boss," Rick had called out, as if it was just another part of the job. Clint, trying to hide his own nerves, nodded. He watched as Rick took the leap, his body sailing through the air, his form perfect, the scene as breathtaking as it was terrifying. The stunt went off without a hitch, but when Rick hit the ground, Clint's heart skipped a beat. There was a sickening thud, a small cry of pain. Rick, though injured, stood up almost immediately, his eyes locked with Clint's. "It's nothing," Rick said, brushing himself off like the tumble was just another minor inconvenience. Clint had been in awe of him then, not just for the physical feat, but for the bravery it took to face danger head-on, without a second thought. After the scene, Clint had pulled Rick aside. "You saved my life out there," Clint said, his voice low. Rick had shrugged, a grin still on his face. "It's what I'm paid for." But Clint knew better. It wasn't about money or fame for Rick. It was about loyalty. It was about trust. And that trust ran both ways. There had been others, too many others. But in every stunt, every dangerous maneuver, Clint had always known that Rick was the one who made it happen. Without Rick, Clint's films wouldn't have had the same raw energy. It was Rick's commitment that made Clint's career possible, and Clint had never truly acknowledged that, not until now. As Clint sits in his study, the memories flood him like a tidal wave. There's a deep pang in his chest as he thinks of the years they spent together, the camaraderie, the unspoken bond of those long days on set. Rick had been more than just a stuntman. He had been Clint's closest ally in the chaotic world of Hollywood. He had been the man who kept Clint grounded, who helped him rise to the top. But then time passed. The world of film shifted. Clint became a legend, while Rick became just another face in the crowd. As Clint's star rose, Rick's light dimmed. It's not that Clint meant to abandon him. It's just that he got lost in the pursuit of more films, more fame, more accolades. Now looking back, Clint can see it all too clearly. He had promised Rick so much. He had promised to always look out for him, to be there when things got tough. But when the cameras stopped rolling and the curtains fell, Clint had disappeared. And Rick was left to face the world alone. The memories sting, sharper than Clint expects. He realizes now, too late, how much he had taken Rick for granted. How much he had relied on Rick without ever truly appreciating the man behind the stunts. Now Clint is faced with the truth. The man who had been there for him at every turn is no longer the young, vibrant stuntman he once knew. The career they built together has crumbled, and Rick is fighting a battle of his own, one that Clint feels he should have been a part of. Clint lets out a heavy sigh, his hand resting on the letter again. It's not just a letter from an old friend, it's a call to action. A chance to right a wrong that has haunted him for years. Clint knows he can't undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, he can start to make things right. It's time to reconnect with the man who once risked everything for him. It's time to honor the promise he made so long ago. Clint stands up, determination settling over him. He can't let Rick slip away into obscurity. Not now. Not after everything they shared. The time for action has come. The decision to reach out should have been easy. After all, Clint had spent years watching his career and legacy grow, his name becoming synonymous with greatness. But as he sat there in his study, his eyes scanning the letter once more, the weight of the choice began to sink in. Reaching out wasn't just about sending a check or making a phone call. It was about confronting the ghosts of his past. It was about facing the truth of how he had let someone who meant so much to him slip away into the background. Clint stood and paced around the room, his boots clicking softly on the wooden floor. The old photographs on the wall seemed to stare at him, their smiles frozen in time. He could hear Rick's voice in his head, remember the sound of the man's infectious laugh during late-night script readings, the camaraderie that existed between them without needing words. They had been a team, in every sense of the word. But time, like the passing of seasons, had a way of changing everything. Hollywood had a way of chewing people up and spitting them out, and Clint had learned that lesson too well. He had been the golden boy, the one who could do no wrong. But Rick had been the one who took the hits. He had been the one who had given everything for the job, his body battered and broken, his youth traded for a paycheck, and his name barely whispered in the shadows of Clint's fame. Clint's jaw clenched as he thought about all the years that had passed without a word from him to Rick. The fame, the accolades, the whirlwind of projects, they had all come at the cost of the one true friendship that had meant something beyond the screen. And now, after all this time, Clint was left wondering if it was too late to make amends. There was also the question of Rick's pride. Would Rick even want Clint to step back into his life? After all, Clint had long since moved on from the world that had defined both of them. The years of fame had worn Clint down in their own way, but they had also distanced him from the very people who had helped him get there. Would Rick see Clint's gesture as genuine, or would it feel like another hollow attempt to clean up a mess that couldn't be fixed? Clint ran a hand through his graying hair, the lines on his face deepening with the weight of the decision. There was a small voice in his head telling him to just leave it be, that he had done enough, that he had earned the right to live his life on his terms. But that voice was drowned out by another, a quieter one that said, "You owe him. You owe him for every moment of sacrifice, every stunt that kept you safe and your career alive. You owe him for the times when he stood by your side, even when nobody else did." Clint's fingers hovered over the phone on his desk. The decision should have been easy, but it felt like the hardest thing he had ever done. What would he say to Rick? How could he explain the years of silence, the broken promise that had never been fulfilled? In the end, Clint knew there was no perfect way to fix what had been broken. But the first step, the only step that mattered, was reaching out. I can't undo the past, he thought, but I can try to do something now. With a deep breath, Clint picked up the phone. He dialed the number on the letter, his heart pounding in his chest. The phone rang once, twice, then someone picked up. Hello? It was Rick's voice. It was unmistakable, even after all these years. The voice that Clint hadn't heard in so long still carried that same warmth, that same dry humor. For a moment, Clint couldn't speak. His throat tightened, and he felt a wave of emotion rush over him. Rick? Clint finally managed, his voice sounding rougher than he expected. There was a long pause on the other end, as if Rick was trying to process the sound of Clint's voice, trying to remember if it was real. Then Rick spoke again, his voice low but filled with disbelief. Clint, is that really you? Clint swallowed hard, fighting back the lump in his throat. Yeah, it's me, Rick. Clint stopped, unsure of how to continue. He had thought he was ready for this, but hearing Rick's voice brought back so many memories, good and bad, that Clint didn't know where to begin. Rick's voice softened, though there was still an edge of caution in it. It's been a long time. What's this about, Clint? What do you want? Clint let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. I wanted to talk. I know I haven't been there for you, Rick. I should have been. I'm sorry. I owe you more than just words, but I want to make things right. Rick didn't respond immediately. There was a silence that stretched on for several long seconds, and Clint wondered if he had made a mistake, if Rick was already too far gone to care about anything Clint could offer. Then finally Rick spoke, his voice quieter now, tinged with something Clint couldn't quite place. You're right. You do owe me more than words. You always did. But I don't know what you want from me now, Clint. It's been too long. Clint felt a pang in his chest. It was the truth, after all. Time had a way of eroding even the strongest bonds. But Clint wasn't giving up, not this time. I don't know what I want either, Clint confessed. But I know that I can't just sit here and pretend everything's fine. I want to make it right. I don't expect anything from you. I just want to show you that I never forgot you. Rick interrupted, his voice low but steady. You want to show me? Clint, you were my hero. I gave everything for you, for your movies, for your career. I was there when nobody else was. And then one day you weren't. I got left behind, Clint. And I don't know if you can fix that. Clint's heart sank, the weight of Rick's words landing hard. But Clint knew deep down that this wasn't something that could be fixed in a conversation. It would take more. Much more. I know, Clint whispered, but I have to try. Let me try. There was a long pause, and Clint held his breath. Would Rick give him another chance? Finally, Rick spoke, the hard edge in his voice softened by something Clint couldn't quite read. All right, Clint. Try. But you better be ready. I'm not the man I was back then. Neither are you. Clint nodded, even though Rick couldn't see him. I'll be ready, Rick. I'll be ready. And with that, the first step had been taken. Clint's heart raced as he drove toward Rick's home the next morning. The quiet countryside rolled by in a blur of greenery, but Clint's mind was a storm. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, and for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he was prepared for what lay ahead. The guilt he had been carrying for so long felt heavier now that he was actually facing it head-on. Was he too late? Was there anything he could say to fix the years of neglect, the silence that had stretched between them? Rick's house appeared in the distance, a small, weathered cabin nestled on the outskirts of town. It was smaller than Clint had imagined, with peeling paint and a yard that looked as though it had been neglected for some time. The windows were dark, and there was no sign of life outside. Clint parked the car, his nerves nearly getting the best of him as he stepped out. He felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the years, the regrets, the burden of a promise he hadn't kept. He walked up to the door slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel pathway. For a moment, Clint hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorbell. Could Rick really be ready to face him after everything? Or would this just open up wounds that had long since been sealed? Before Clint could knock, the door creaked open, and there stood Rick. He looked older, worn down by the years, his face lined with the marks of time and hardship. His hair had thinned, his body had softened, and there was an unmistakable weariness in his eyes that Clint had never seen before. But despite the changes, Rick's presence was as striking as ever. He still carried that rugged edge, that quiet strength that Clint had admired all those years ago. For a brief moment, neither of them said a word. They just stood there, staring at each other, as if trying to make sense of the years that had passed. Then Rick spoke. "So, you actually showed up," he said, his voice dry, but there was something else in it, a guarded surprise, as if he didn't quite believe Clint was really here. "I wasn't sure you would." Clint's throat tightened, the words stuck in his chest. He had imagined this moment countless times, but nothing could prepare him for the reality of standing in front of Rick, the man he had promised to never forget. "I know I don't have the right to ask for your forgiveness," Clint said, his voice low, steady. "But I'm here. And I'm sorry, Rick. I'm so sorry for everything. For disappearing. For taking you for granted. For not being there when you needed me the most." Rick's eyes flickered with something, anger perhaps, or maybe just pain. He stepped back, allowing Clint to enter, but the space between them still felt vast, like an ocean of years and unresolved tension. "You think an apology fixes all of that?" Rick's voice cracked, his anger evident. "You think a couple of words can just erase the years of silence? The years of being forgotten?" Clint's heart sank at the bitterness in Rick's voice. He hadn't expected Rick to forgive him right away, but the sting of those words cut deeper than Clint had anticipated. He followed Rick inside, unsure of what to say next. The small house was sparsely decorated, the walls adorned with a few faded pictures from their past. It was clear that Rick had held on to some memories, but they were tucked away in corners, buried beneath the weight of what had come after. Rick moved to the kitchen, grabbing a bottle of whiskey from the counter and pouring a drink. He didn't offer Clint anything. Instead, he stared out the window, his back to Clint. "It's not about apologies, Clint," Rick muttered, his tone softer now, but still laced with hurt. "It's about what you did after everything. You left me. You left us all. The minute you didn't need us anymore, you were gone. And you didn't even look back." Clint swallowed hard, the guilt threatening to choke him. "I didn't mean to. I just got caught up in the fame. The next movie. The next script. The next big thing. But you were always there. You were always the one who showed up, no matter what. And Rick interrupted, turning to face him. "And you took it all for granted. You never even thought to check in. To see how I was doing. To see how any of us were doing. You just moved on, Clint. And I'm left here, dealing with everything I sacrificed for you." Clint's chest tightened as he realized the depth of Rick's pain. All these years, he had buried the hurt and had convinced himself that Rick understood, that Rick knew he was appreciated. But Rick hadn't. Not really. The truth was staring Clint in the face now. Rick had been left behind. And Clint had been so wrapped up in his own success that he hadn't even noticed. "I was selfish," Clint said, the words falling out with a weight he had never allowed himself to feel. "I thought I could just leave it all behind. But I was wrong. You deserve better than that, Rick. You always did." Rick didn't say anything for a moment, his eyes hard and unreadable. He took another sip of whiskey, his gaze drifting to the photographs on the wall, to the faded memories of the days when they had been invincible. "You can't just make it better, Clint," Rick said finally, his voice quieter now, more resigned. "You can't just rewrite history." Clint stepped closer, his eyes never leaving Rick's. "I know," he said softly. "But I can try. I can start now. If you'll let me." For a long time, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy with the weight of what had been, and what could have been. Clint could see the cracks in Rick's armor, the flickers of vulnerability that were buried under the layers of anger and hurt. Rick had been carrying this for years, and Clint could feel the years of resentment between them like a wall that was slowly beginning to crack. "All right," Rick finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Try. I don't know if I can trust you again, but I'll let you try." Clint nodded, a small spark of hope flickering in his chest. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. And that was all Clint could ask for. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but one thing was certain, he would walk it. No matter how long it took. No matter how much it hurt. As Clint sat down at the kitchen table, the room felt quieter, more intimate than it had before. The years of separation were still there, but now there was something else, a sense of possibility, a chance to rebuild what had been lost. It wasn't going to be easy, Clint knew that, but it was the only thing that mattered now. Clint's visits to Rick became more frequent after that first reunion. He didn't expect anything immediate. He knew it would take time to rebuild what had been broken between them. The trust, the friendship, all of it had eroded over the years, and Clint understood that he would have to prove himself worthy of Rick's time, let alone his forgiveness. The first few weeks were awkward. They didn't talk about the past much. Instead, they spent time in silence, Clint working in the yard, Rick tinkering with old tools and equipment he had collected over the years. But little by little, the walls that had been built between them started to come down. Clint, ever the stoic, didn't push. He knew that actions spoke louder than words, and every moment he spent showing up, being present, meant more than any apology ever could. But Clint knew he couldn't just fix things by sitting in silence, hoping that time would heal the wounds. He had to do something big, something that would show Rick that he wasn't just here because he felt guilty. He was here because Rick mattered. He was here because Clint had failed as a friend, and he needed to make things right. One evening, as they sat together in Rick's small living room, Clint brought it up. "Rick," Clint began, his voice calm but firm. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, that I never checked in on you, never looked back after everything you did for me. And I get it. I've been selfish. But I don't want to be that man anymore. I don't want to be the guy who walks away and leaves people behind." Rick raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. He didn't say anything, but Clint could see the doubt in his eyes. "I know I can't change the past," Clint continued, "but I can try to make it better. You gave so much for me. I owe you more than just words. And I want to give something back to you. Something that might help, something that might show you I mean it." Rick's eyes narrowed, waiting for Clint to finish. He was patient, but Clint could sense the caution still hanging in the air. "I'm starting a fundraiser," Clint said, his voice steady, looking Rick in the eye. "I want to raise awareness for stuntmen like you, guys who put their lives on the line for movies, only to be forgotten when the cameras stop rolling. You're not just another guy in the background, Rick. You're a hero, and it's time the world knew that." Rick blinked, clearly taken aback. "A fundraiser? For me?" Clint nodded. "For all of you. For all the guys who risked everything. I'm putting your name on it. I'm making sure people understand what you and the others did, not just for the films, but for the people who loved them." Rick leaned back in his chair, staring at Clint, his face unreadable. He wasn't sure whether to be offended, surprised, or grateful. "You really think people will care?" "I don't know," Clint admitted, "but I'm going to make sure they do. This isn't about just getting you the help you need. It's about giving you the dignity you deserve. You gave everything to those movies, Rick. You made me look good. And now, I want to make sure you get something in return." The room fell silent for a moment as Rick processed what Clint had said. He took a long swig from his glass, his face still tight with emotion. Clint waited, understanding that this wasn't something that could be accepted right away. It was a gesture, and Rick would have to decide if he believed it was genuine. Finally, Rick spoke, his voice low but softer than before. "I never asked for anything, Clint. Not from you, not from anyone. But this feels different." Clint gave him a small smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "It's not just about money. It's about showing the world that what you did, what all of you did, mattered. It's about making sure people know that you weren't just some guy in the background." Rick stood up, walking over to the window and looking out over the yard, lost in thought. Clint didn't push him, giving him the space to process it all. But inside, Clint felt a glimmer of hope. He didn't expect an immediate answer. He didn't expect Rick to trust him fully yet. But this was the beginning of something. It was the first step toward redemption, and it wasn't just for Rick, it was for Clint too. After a long moment, Rick turned back around, his expression still hard to read. "I don't know if people will care, Clint. I don't know if they'll give a damn about what we did all those years ago. But I'll tell you this, if you're really going to do this, if you're really going to stand by me, then I'll let you." Clint's heart swelled with emotion. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a chance. A chance to prove that his actions were more than just an attempt to erase guilt. This was about doing something right, something that could impact not just Rick's life, but the lives of so many others who had been forgotten. "Thank you," Clint said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You won't regret it, Rick. I'm going to make sure of that." Rick gave a small nod, but the skepticism was still there. It would take time. Clint knew that. But this was the start of something bigger than either of them. This was the moment when Clint knew he wasn't just trying to right the wrong he had done to Rick. He was trying to change something in himself, to be the man he always should have been. In the weeks that followed, Clint did everything he could to make the fundraiser a reality. He used his connections, his reputation, and his wealth of Hollywood influence to make it happen. He put together a team, and slowly but surely, the project began to take shape. The media, the fans, the industry, they all started to take notice. The fundraiser gained traction, and Clint's commitment to honoring Rick's legacy spread like wildfire. As the donations rolled in and the campaign gained momentum, Clint couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. This wasn't just about money. It was about restoring dignity to a group of people who had been invisible for too long. And it was about restoring his own sense of self-worth, his own ability to stand by those who had stood by him. Through it all, Clint never forgot Rick. Every step of the way, he made sure to involve Rick, to include him in the process. This was his chance to show that he wasn't just making a public gesture. This was about Rick's story, Rick's life, and Clint was determined to make sure that story was told. And with each passing day, Clint saw the transformation in Rick. Slowly, the bitterness and skepticism began to fade. The man Clint had once known as a fearless stuntman was starting to come back to life, bit by bit, not because of the money or the recognition, but because Clint had shown up when it mattered most. For the first time in years, Clint knew that he was on the right path. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't done. But he was doing the work, not just for Rick, but for himself. And that, Clint thought, was worth everything. Months had passed since Clint took the first step toward making things right. The fundraiser had grown beyond Clint's expectations, gaining traction in the industry and beyond. The media buzzed with stories about the stuntmen who had been forgotten, the unsung heroes of Hollywood's golden age. And at the heart of it all was Rick, his name, his face, his story now a part of the larger narrative Clint had worked so tirelessly to create. Rick's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. At first, he was wary of the attention, unwilling to let the world see his vulnerability. But Clint had slowly, patiently shown him that it wasn't about being the center of attention. It was about recognition, acknowledgement, and a chance to stand tall once more. The money that came in didn't just provide for Rick's medical bills and financial struggles. It restored something far more valuable, the sense of self-worth that had been chipped away over the years. One late afternoon, Clint sat at the edge of Rick's porch, the sun dipping low on the horizon. It was a peaceful scene, quiet, tranquil, and for the first time, Clint felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from fame or accolades, but the kind that came from knowing he had done something right, something that mattered. Rick sat beside him, his eyes on the fading light, his face softer than it had been in months. The tension that had once defined their relationship was gone, replaced by something else, a quiet understanding. "You've done a good thing, Clint," Rick said, his voice gravelly but sincere. "You didn't have to. Hell, you could have just let me fade into the background like everyone else. But you didn't. You kept your word." Clint glanced at him, his face thoughtful. "I wasn't sure it would be enough," he said quietly. "I wasn't sure you'd ever believe I was really here for you. But I had to try." Rick shook his head slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You tried, all right. And I don't think I'll ever forget it. For the first time in a long while, I feel like I'm seen. Like what I did actually mattered." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. Clint could feel the weight of what they both had gone through. The years of separation, the pain of lost time, and the joy of rediscovery. They had both been broken in different ways, but they were healing now, piece by piece, not because they had to, but because they were willing to. Clint's eyes grew distant, as though he was thinking back on the journey, the twists and turns that had led him here. He thought about the fame, the glory, the thrill of the movies. He thought about the people who had come and gone, those who had used him, and those he had used in turn. But through it all, it was Rick who had been there, the one who had stood beside him when the cameras stopped rolling and the real work began. And it was Rick who had carried the weight of Clint's success without ever asking for anything in return. "I think I've been running from something, Rick," Clint admitted, his voice rough. "Running from the fact that I've always been so focused on what I could get that I never thought about what I was leaving behind. You were part of that, and I didn't even realize it until it was almost too late." Rick didn't say anything, but he nodded, as if understanding more than Clint had expected. They sat in silence, watching the sun sink lower in the sky, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The weight of the years was still there, but it wasn't suffocating anymore. Clint didn't feel the need to rush. He knew the road to redemption wasn't a straight line, but a winding path, one that required patience, humility, and above all, a willingness to face the mistakes of the past. As the stars began to emerge, Clint spoke again, this time with a hint of hope in his voice. You know, I'm thinking about doing something else. Something for all the guys like you. There are so many more out there, men and women who gave everything for this business and were never properly recognized. I want to make sure their stories are told. Rick turned to him, his expression thoughtful. You serious? Clint nodded, his eyes steady. I've started something bigger than I ever realized. And I don't think it's over yet. I want to make sure that no one is forgotten again. Not while I'm still here to do something about it. Rick studied him for a moment, then cracked a small grin. Well, Clint, I think you're finally starting to get it. The two men shared a moment of quiet laughter, and for the first time in years, Clint felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. He wasn't perfect. He wasn't even sure he would ever completely redeem himself. But he was trying, and that was enough. As the night stretched on, Clint and Rick stayed outside, talking about old films, the changes in Hollywood, and the future. The past was still there, lurking in the background, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. They both knew the road ahead would have its challenges, but at least now, they were walking it together. In the days that followed, the fundraising efforts continued to grow. Clint worked tirelessly to ensure that the stories of stunt men and women were told, stories of sacrifice, bravery, and the untold risks that had been taken to make the films that so many loved. The media picked up the stories, and soon, Clint's initiative became a movement, one that honored the people who had made Hollywood what it was but had been forgotten in the rush of fame and fortune. For Rick, the gesture was a reminder that even in the darkest times, there could be redemption. He wasn't just a forgotten stuntman anymore. He was a part of something larger, something that celebrated the unsung heroes who had built the foundation of the film industry. As Clint reflected on the months that had passed, he realized that he had gained more than just the restoration of a friendship. He had gained a deeper understanding of what it meant to truly honor someone. And in doing so, he had finally honored himself. The story of Clint and Rick wasn't just about one man helping another. It was about two souls coming to terms with the past, forgiving each other, and finding a way to move forward together. And in the end, that was the greatest redemption of all. The night had fallen completely now, the stars bright overhead. Clint and Rick were no longer defined by what had happened in the past. They were defined by what they were willing to do now, and that, Clint knew, was all that truly mattered.